Welcome to the Hidden Corners, where truth and terror collide. Discover a realm where the lines between the living and the supernatural blur, as you embark on a journey to the paranormal and visit the mysterious hidden corners of your mind. Welcome to the Hidden Corners. Tonight we have two short stories for you, The Stuffed Dog and The Dead Know All. The stuffed dog sat on a low table in the darkest corner of the study. It was a black boxer with short bristly hair that was still sleek. Mrs. Heathcote dusted it every week and rubbed oil into its hair every month. She took good care of the boxer in remembrance of her husband, the late Mr. Heathcote. He and the dog had died on the same day 20 years ago. The dog had been devoted to Mr. Heathcote. Mrs. Heathcote liked to think it had died out of grief at its master's death. The coroner, however, didn't find that a satisfactory explanation. Mr. Heathcote, you see, had died a very mysterious death, and when the boxer died the same day, the coroner had naturally been suspicious. He ordered an autopsy of both bodies, Mr. Heathcote's and the dog's, but no medical cause for either death had been determined. Mrs. Heathcote buried her husband and had the boxer stuffed. It had sat in that corner of the study for 20 years, except, that is, on one day of each year, the anniversary of Mr. Heathcote's death. On that day, Mrs. Heathcote would lift the stuffed dog into her arms, carry him to the car, and drive with him beside her on the front seat to the cemetery. There she would lay the dog on top of her husband's grave. She would smile to herself, imagining that the three of them were all together again. This year Mrs. Heathcote had asked her grandson, Theodore, to help her carry the dog to the cemetery. She was having back trouble, and the stuffed dog was heavy. Theodore was 12. He had never met his grandfather, and he didn't understand why his grandmother took the stuffed animal to the cemetery every year. But at his mother's insistence, he agreed to spend this weekend with his grandmother. He arrived early Saturday morning, the day of the pilgrimage to the cemetery. "Teddy, you're so grown up," Mrs. Heathcote said as she squeezed Theodore up against her, just as she had always done. Theodore drew away from his grandmother. He noticed that his glasses had become smeared by something on her apron. As he pulled out his handkerchief and started to clean his glasses, he said, "Don't call me Teddy." "Yes, Theodore, I'll try to remember," Mrs. Heathcote said apologetically. "Now, come along and help me with the dear doggie. It looks like it may rain today, so we must be off to the cemetery right away." Theodore followed his grandmother into the house. He began to wish he hadn't let his mother persuade him to come. As he walked into the study, he felt the revulsion creep into his body. It was the same revulsion he had always felt toward this room. He despised the stuffed dog. As a child, he had been locked in this room once by his grandmother as punishment. He had sat in the room in the slowly fading light until it was pitch black, and during that whole time the stuffed dog had stared at him with its beady eyes. He remembered how the cruel snarl on the dog's lips had haunted him in nightmares for weeks after. He remembered how the dog had filled him with a sinister feeling of fear. It was dead, and yet it seemed not dead. Theodore, pick the dog up," his grandmother said. Theodore walked over to the dog, but the idea of touching it made him sick. "Really, Theodore, we must hurry. Lift the dog from the table." Theodore put his hands on the stuffed dog. Its greasy fur felt unnatural to him. He lifted it from the table and carried it to the car as fast as he could. He set it on the front seat. His grandmother came out of the house as he started to get into the back seat. "No, Teddy, sit in the front with me and the dog. There's plenty of room." As usual, Theodore obeyed. He moved the stuffed dog over on the seat toward his grandmother. They were silent on the drive to the cemetery. Mrs. Heathcote seemed wrapped up in memories, and Theodore found the whole situation too ridiculous to talk about. He wondered if his grandmother was going batty. Mrs. Heathcote stopped the car near her husband's grave. "Teddy, Theodore, bring the dog now." Theodore picked up the dog again. Its face stared up at him, the mouth fixed in that awful snarl. Following his grandmother's directions, Theodore lay the dog on top of his grandfather's grave. He asked to be excused then. He wanted to get away from his grandmother and the dog, and the creepy feeling he had from being around them. After a half-hour of walking around the cemetery, Theodore came back to his grandfather's grave. His grandmother's eyes were red and swollen from crying, but her face was beaming with a smile. "Isn't it lovely, Teddy, seeing the two together like that?" Theodore looked up with disgust at the stuffed dog lying on the grave. "Is it time to go now?" he asked. "Yes, dear, bring the dog back to the car." Theodore bent down and picked up the dog. Then he let it fall back onto the grave. "Theodore, what's wrong with you?" Mrs. Heathcote asked angrily. But Theodore didn't know what to say. He didn't know how to tell her that the dog seemed warm now, as if it were alive. He fought the sickening disgust that he felt and stooped down to pick it up again. Yes, the dog was warm. After he got the dog back into the car, Theodore went back into the back seat and refused to move up front. During the ride home, all he could think of was having to pick the dog up again. When they arrived home, Theodore gritted his teeth and carried the dog into the house. He never looked at the animal. He set it down in the study and then rushed out of the room. Mrs. Heathcote watched him, shaking her head. My, Theodore, you certainly are acting strange today. You young people haven't any sense, do you?" Theodore wanted to leave his grandmother's house, but he had no choice. His mother had promised he would stay overnight. Theodore vowed never to go into that study again. He passed the afternoon reading. While he was eating his grandmother's delicious supper, he was almost happy he had stayed. The two of them settled down to play checkers after the dishes were washed. They played checkers for 2 hours. Theodore let his grandmother win one game. "You've tired me out, Theodore," Mrs. Heathcote declared sleepily after losing her 15th game. "Be a good boy and fetch the matches from the mantel in the study. I want to light a candle in your room tonight. I want it to be just like when your mother was little." Mrs. Heathcote began her slow walk up the stairs to the bedrooms. "Bring the matches up when you come to bed, Teddy." Theodore looked around the living room for a pack of matches, but he couldn't find any. There weren't any matches in the kitchen drawers either. Finally, he walked up to the study door. He opened it and looked inside. It was too dark to see anything, even the dog. He decided to get the matches without turning the light on. He knew exactly where the mantel was in the room. He slipped into the room and felt along the wall until his hand reached the mantel. His fingers closed around the matchbox. Just then, he thought he heard a noise from the corner of the room, a noise like a growl. Theodore struck one of the matches against the box. In the burst of light from the match, he saw the dog's beady eyes looking at him. A wave of hatred came over Theodore. That cursed dog. With the match trembling in his hand, Theodore walked toward the stuffed dog. He looked at the fat jowls sagging around the cruel mouth. He stared into the beady eyes. As he came nearer to the dog, he saw its long whiskers. Theodore laughed and shoved the match into those ugly whiskers. Upstairs, Mrs. Heathcote was putting on her nightrobe when she heard the scream. It was a horrible, terrified scream. She rushed down the steps as fast as her old legs would carry her. She hurried into the study. Theodore was lying on the floor. His face had a look of terror on it. His arms and legs were sticking out stiff from his body. "Oh, no, no, not again!" Mrs. Heathcote panted as she ran to call the doctor. The doctor came within 10 minutes, but that didn't matter. Theodore was already dead. The doctor said there would have to be an autopsy. Mrs. Heathcote nodded her head in agreement. "He looks so much like my husband when he died," she said wistfully to herself. They carried Theodore out of the study, and once again the room was left in darkness. Then a low snarl came from the corner, and a drop of bloody saliva fell from the stuffed dog's mouth.
The Dead Know All by Norman A. Daniels. It felt good to be out of the room where death's wings cast murky shadows. June Hunter, immaculate in her starched white nurse's uniform, stood on the terrace overlooking the sea, inhaling fresh, pure air untainted by the medicinal odors of the sick room. She moved over against the waist-high iron grillwork, which protected anyone who stood too close to the edge of the terrace. She looked down at the jagged, ugly rocks far below and shivered. The first day she had arrived at Fenton Manor, Jim Fenton's body was being lifted from those rocks. A dozen hours later, he died without regaining consciousness. The coroner's verdict had been suicide. Jim Fenton had fallen from this terrace and the guardrails were too high to permit the death to be listed as accidental. Phyllis Fenton, old, wrinkled, austere, was Jim Fenton's grandmother. After his death, she seemed to lose whatever spark of vitality had kept her frail body from going far beyond the normal span of life. June Hunter had stayed on to take care of the old lady. Not that she liked the job so much, but jobs were scarce and the salary was good here. Someone stepped beside her and June caught the odor of whiskey. She didn't have to turn her head to identify the newcomer. It was Clyde Marshall, the only surviving member of the Fenton family. Marshall, who drank too much, gambled too much, and hated the old lady who ruled his life. Now she was dying and he was already mentally spending the fortune she would leave him. "A long way down," he said sarcastically. "Jim found out just how far down, eh, June?" "I'm sorry, Mrs. Fenton needs me." June faced him, her cheeks flushed with anger. Marshall grabbed her arm. "Now see here," he snarled. "I haven't done anything to make you despise me. Listen, the old lady is going out for sure this time. I know soon as she kicks off, I'll have plenty. I'll be a nice guy to know." June pulled herself free and walked off the terrace. Marshall followed her, but he stopped halfway across a big living room. Dr. Redfern was coming down the stairs. He looked at Marshall coldly, motioned June to follow, and led her into the study. He closed the door before he spoke. "She'll slip out this afternoon, I'm afraid. Poor old lady. Nothing left to live for since her grandson fell over that terrace. Look here, June, I don't like leaving you alone in this house with Marshall. He's not to be trusted. In fact, I lay an even bet that he's a murderer." "A murderer?" June gasped. "You mean Jim Fenton?" "That's what I think," Dr. Redfern nodded. "Jim was not a suicidal type. The old lady believes the same thing, just told me so, in fact, and she also told me other things. Well, if you're sure it's all right, I'll be on my way. Phone me if she goes out." Redfern picked up his bag and closed the front door. June walked slowly up the stairs to the sick room. She stepped in and walked over to the huge bed on which lay a tiny pit of humanity, with only a meager spark of life left. The dying woman opened her eyes as June arranged the pillow gently, and a smile stole across her thin face. "You won't have to put up with me much longer, my child. No, don't lie. I know when the end is near, and honestly, I'm not sorry. I've lived long, too long since Jim died. But I wanted to talk to you. There is something—" "Please," June patted the old woman's hand. "Don't try to talk. Tomorrow you'll feel stronger." "Tomorrow?" Phyllis Fenton cackled in dry humor. "All my tomorrows are wrapped up in today, child. There will be no tomorrow for me, not one. Now listen carefully. They told me Jim committed suicide. I don't think he did. Soon, very soon, I'll know for sure. They say that the dead know everything. My nephew Clyde Marshall is hanging around like a buzzard, waiting for me to die. He believes he will get my money, but I fooled him. He's a philandering wretch, not worthy of this family. He is the only man who would profit at Jim's death. Therefore,
I gave Dr. Redfern a new will which names you, my child, as his sole beneficiary. Clyde get what he deserves. Nothing.
June only smiled. She had heard dying, delirious people talk this way before.
"Please, Mrs. Fenton, don't talk," she murmured. "I'd rather you rested. You need all your strength."
Phyllis Fenton coughed. A paroxysm of pain crossed her face. The breath in her throat rattled horribly, and June felt the aged hand tighten on her arm. The old woman's eyes were filming over. This was to be the end, then. June picked up the hand, held it gently, and let her finger rest against the pulse. It was flickering, like the flame of a candle when it reaches the final drop of tallow. Somehow June found herself murmuring a prayer, and tears rolled unchecked down her cheeks. One last convulsive shudder, and death picked up his trappings to move on to a new victim. Phyllis Fenton was dead, her face creased in the last frozen lines of agony. June drew a long breath and checked the time automatically. It was just 10 after 2. It was better this way. She had lived long, and for weeks the spark of life had slowly grown weaker and weaker. June arose. She had certain duties to perform before she phoned the doctor and the undertaker. She took a spool of surgical gauze from her bag, tenderly crossed the old woman's dead arms and tied them together, fastening the gauze with a safety pin. Then she tied the ankles, closed the staring eyes, and pulled the sheet over the corpse. As she straightened up, someone stepped from behind her with a cry of horror. June moved back. It was Marshall. He didn't look at the sheet-covered corpse of his aunt. No sorrow registered in his deep-set eyes, only a hatred that brought his lips back in a scowl.
"She's dead, and I'm glad. But she tricked me at the end. If I'd known that fool doctor had a new will, I'd have killed him. I waited 25 years only to be cheated by one of her whims. Damn her soul!"
June put both hands against his chest and pushed him out of the room. She said nothing, but slowly a feeling of terror was creeping over her. This man was half mad. He had listened, heard his aunt's dying words, and he knew that he had lost everything. Marshall was strong, powerfully built and cruel. She was alone in this vast house with him. The influence of his aunt's character and her millions on him was now gone. He suddenly seized June's arm in a painful grasp and yanked her out of the death room. Without a word, she was propelled down the steps and into the spacious living room. Marshall flung her into a chair.
"So," he snarled, "you are the heiress, a double-crosser who convinced her I shouldn't have the money. Well, I shall have it, do you hear? It's rightfully mine. I've put up with her tantrums for years to get it, and I won't be cheated now."
June forced herself to remain cool.
"You're mad," she said. "Listen to me. I don't want that money. I didn't encourage her to will it to me, but it is mine. You can't stop Dr. Redfern from turning the new will over to the attorneys."
Marshall's eyes narrowed. Suddenly he lunged for her, pinned her to the chair, and took out a coil of thin rope from his pocket. When she tried to resist, he struck her savagely across the face. He twisted the rope around her wrists and ankles, lashed them tight. Then he stepped back.
"No, you're right. I can't stop those lawyers from getting the will, but I can stop myself from losing the money that I lived years to get. My aunt made a will leaving you the money. But what if you died? What if you had an accident? I'd swear you were dead before my aunt died. I testify she was alive when you died, which automatically voids the will, and I get everything. Who dispute my word? The difference in time between your death and hers is so small that no doctor could swear who died first. I said I'd be a nice guy to know after I got the money, but I'm not a nice guy when I see that dough slipping out of my hands."
Marshall wheeled and walked swiftly out on the terrace. June, her eyes wide with horror, watched him. Marshall took a wrench from his pocket and carefully patted his teeth with pieces of soft flannel. Then he attacked the railing until he had one length of it free. He glanced over his shoulder, grinning sardonically at June. He calmly reinserted the length of railing, twisting it only a slight bit. Then he carefully wiped the metal with a cloth to remove fingerprints. After that was finished, he returned to stand over June. "See what happens, beautiful? You're going to have an accident. I've been prepared for something like this. You'll lean up against the railing and it'll give way. They'll find one part of it badly rusted. I took care of that weeks ago right after Jim pitched over. They said he committed suicide. What a laugh. He'd leaned against the railing too, and it gave way. He went over, but I put the railing back in place so nobody noticed it.
They thought he jumped on purpose. I'm clever, you see. No one even suspected. And I was going to let it look like an accident, but I thought if they said suicide, it might make the old lady die faster. And it did, too.
You murdered him, June cried. You fixed the railing so he fell.
Sure I did, and I got away with it.
Marshall's lips parted in a cold smile.
I'll get away with it again, too. This time they'll say it was accidental, and I'll be very, very sorry that I didn't have the railing examined more carefully after Jim died. The rust on it looks real. No one can prove I weakened it with acid.
Marshall untied her ankles and then freed her wrists. He seized her by both arms and propelled her towards the terrace. June screamed, but it was only a release from the emotions raging within her. No one lived within 5 miles of this big house that overlooked the sea and the jagged rocks on the shore. Then suddenly, Marshall paused. Somewhere upstairs, a door slammed. He let go of June, and she made a valiant effort to get clear of him, but he was faster. He lunged after her, whirled her around, and struck her a cruel blow across the chin. June saw the room gyrate crazily. She was aware of a blackness stealing over her. The floor came up mysteriously. She crumpled and lay very still. Vaguely, she seemed to remember that slamming door in this house of death and murder. But nothing else happened. The wind perhaps had forced the door shut. Marshall regained control of his nerves and bent down to pick her up. It would be over soon now. She was only half conscious and incapable of the slightest resistance, even if she had been strong enough to overcome his brutal strength. His hands curled around her wrists. Then Marshall paused again and cocked his head. Someone was moving down the stairs, walking down with light, steady steps, and the only other occupant of this house was a dead woman. Marshall spun around, darted into the hallway. He seized a heavy silver candelabra. June watched him. Everything seemed miles away. Marshall looked up the stairs. The heavy weapon he held over his head came down slowly, and his arms hung limply by his sides. He began backing into the room. His face was dead white. His lips trembled, and his eyes were dilated in terror. June gave a gasp. She saw the hem of the old-fashioned nightgown Phyllis Fenton had worn in death. Naked feet padded down the stairway slowly, methodically. It couldn't be Phyllis Fenton. Yet it was. She had died. June knew the symptoms of death. She couldn't possibly have been mistaken. Yet Phyllis Fenton came into that room as austere and stately as she had moved in life. Aunt Phyllis, Marshall gasped. I thought...
You thought I was dead, she interrupted. Fool! Do you think I'd go and leave this girl in your hands? Clyde, sit down.
But the madness that had seeped into Marshall's soul wasn't to be routed so easily. He looked from the white, pallid face of his aunt and June's staring, horrified eyes.
It's a trick, he snarled. It's an attempt to fool me, but it won't work. I wanted to kill you for years. Years! You wouldn't die. You hung on to tantalize me, to wave that will before my eyes. Force me to obey every damn crazy whim you could think up. Well, that's over now. You're really going to die this time. I'll wring that scrawny neck of yours. I'll kill you slowly, make you suffer as you made me. I'll have your money. You can't stop me.
No,
June heard her own voice pleading wildly.
Marshall, please don't kill her. She's ill. I thought she had died. She won't be able to stand much. She can't do this. I'll turn all the money over to you. She's old and terribly sick.
June tried to get up from the floor. A hand she couldn't see had closed around her wrist. It was a wrinkled hand with thin, emaciated fingers. It was the same hand she had held in death. It was Phyllis Fenton's hand. Yet she stood 10 feet away and her arms were at her sides. A soft, gentle voice whispered, and it was the voice of Phyllis Fenton. Yet her lips never moved.
Don't worry, my child. You have nothing to fear. He can't harm me. And now I know what happened to Jim. Didn't I say that the dead know everything?
A scream welled up in June's throat, but something held it in check. Perhaps it was the soothing quality of that ghostly voice. Perhaps it was the tender touch of the hand on her arm. Marshall roared in mad rage. He leapt for the old woman. His hands gripped her throat, squeezing it unmercifully. June started up again, but that same gentle touch checked her. She could only watch while her heart pounded wildly. Marshall lifted the old woman from the floor, lifted her with his hands wound around her thin throat. He hurled her on the Davenport, put both knees on her frail chest, and his fingers sank deeply into her throat.
You'll not rob me, he howled. Not of the money that is rightfully mine.
She didn't move, didn't try to fight back. Marshall squeezed that age-wrinkled throat for 5 minutes. Then he shoved her back, arose, and rubbed his hands. "There," he snarled. "You'll not trick me again. As for you, it's your turn now." He whirled around and grimaced at June. He advanced a step, and June tried to scream again. The gentle touch on her arm was gone. No voice whispered words of encouragement in her ear. She was alone with him, unutterably alone. For this time there could be no question of Phyllis Fenton's death. Marshall had all but broken her neck. He leered at June, reached out 2 clawing hands. "Clyde!" The voice was calm, without either reproach or surprise. Marshall flung himself around, his mouth agape. Phyllis Fenton stood in the doorway, exactly as she had been standing when he leapt upon her with strangling fingers. He looked at the Davenport. There was no corpse lying there, stilled in death. Marshall's face was crimson. As June watched it slowly turn to purple, his eyes were protruding from their sockets, his whole body was trembling visibly. A scream of rage escaped his lips, and once again he leapt for her. She didn't move. His hands closed around her throat, but there was no throat. He found that his fingers interlocked, squeezed only themselves. Yet she stood there calmly, sedately. He could see his own hands through her throat. Marshall flung himself away. He was cackling horribly, now the signs of stark madness shone on his face. He covered his eyes and staggered back. The old woman moved towards him slowly, inexorably as death itself. Marshall gave a strangled shout and retreated. She matched her steps with his own. He was out of the room on the terrace now and still backing. He touched the loosened rail, straining forward. The old woman was still coming towards him. He forgot about the railing and put his weight against it. His hand grabbed vainly for support but found none. June had a fleeting glimpse of a face creased in terror. 5 seconds later, she heard the crash of Marshall's body against the rocks below. June closed her eyes and shuddered. Something touched her wrist gently and she looked up. Phyllis Fenton stood over her, smiling gently.
"I am so tired, child. This has been a great effort. Sleep a few moments. You'll be quite all right then. Sleep brings dreams. May all the rest of yours be sweeter than this one."
June found that her eyes closed involuntarily. How many minutes she remained like that she didn't know until much later. When she opened her eyes again, she was alone in the room. She seized a chair and pulled herself up. She slowly rubbed her forehead and tried to puzzle out what had happened. Then memory returned. She whirled and ran out to the terrace. The waist-high railing was broken. The end of it showed rusty brown. No one can prove it wasn't real rust, Clyde Marshall had said. She looked over the ledge. There was a dark object flung across the rocks. June turned quickly and raced upstairs. The door of the death room was closed. She opened it and turned on the light. The sheeted form of the old lady lay on the bed. June raised the cover. Phyllis Fenton's face wore a composed smile of peace. The agonizing lines brought on by death were gone. Her hands were folded around her thin chest, the wrists tied by surgical gauze. The safety pin glittered oddly in the light. Her ankles were similarly fastened, just as June had left them. For a full minute, June stood there quickly, her head bowed. Then she looked at the clock. It was 2:54. Phyllis Fenton had died at 2:10. June walked over to the phone and dialed the number.
"Dr. Redfern, this is Nurse Hunter. Please come up here quickly. Clyde Marshall tumbled off the terrace." "Yes, just as Jim Fenton did, but this time the railing gave way. He must have been very rested and weak. I don't feel very well. I guess I fainted because I should have phoned you the moment Mrs. Fenton died. Yes, she's gone. She died."
June looked at the clock again.
"At exactly 2:10.